And this is one of the questions I wanted to ask you from what you had mentioned at the beginning. You talked about these cues that some of these people, you call them the bad guys, right? So you have these bad guys that emit these cues that you might be able to detect the badness, yet they seem to be able to rise to the top and still amass influence. What's going on there?
Yeah. So our brain is a cue reading machine. It is adapted to be a cue reading machine. What's interesting is we tend to read cues subconsciously, and it's only when a cue comes into our consciousness that we can activate it. The goal with cues is as you read, there's 96 cues in the book. As you read them, my goal is, and as people have begun to read it, they're like, oh, I've seen that cue. All I'm doing is taking your already spidey sense, amazing thing that you have in your brain to read these cues and just bringing it to your consciousness so you can activate it. And what's really interesting, I'll give you a specific study that it changed the way that I thought about nonverbal cues. Is one research study found that when we spot a cue of social rejection, so this could be verbal, nonverbal, or vocal. So let me give you an example of each. So a nonverbal cue of social rejection would be an eye roll while you're talking. It might be a disgust nose crinkle when you say something to someone, a colleague. It might be a turn away or a look back or an overhead gaze. Okay, those are nonverbal cues of social rejection. A vocal cue of social rejection might be, right? You hear, like, I'm irritated, I'm exasperated, or, right, like, I don't believe you. So it could be a vocalization. And a verbal cue of social rejection would be, and this happens all the time in meetings, I don't think we can do that. I don't think so. I don't like that idea. Probably not. What are you doing here? Right? Those are all verbal, very clear verbal cues of, I didn't say the right thing or I'm not in the right place. Okay. So if we spot a cue of social rejection in any channel, our field of vision widens. They've actually measured that the way that our pupils dilate, they expand to take in more. We can see more. The reason for this is because our body instinctively spotted that cue, even if consciously you didn't realize it. And we don't want to be rejected socially, right? Back in our caveman days, that would have threatened our survival. So what happens is our body immediately adapts to it, widens our field of vision to see, does anyone else not like me? What's my escape route? What do I do next? And so following that cue of social rejection, your body actually changes. And there are so many ways this happens. Cues that we spot not only affect us subconsciously where we get that spidey sense, it actually changes our physiology.
Oh my God. So now, this is what's fascinating is I hear this and I start thinking, okay, I can become aware of this, which means I can be more in control in the way that I react, especially if let's say I'm in a meeting, right? Or I'm dealing, maybe I'm a salesperson, I'm presenting to a group and I'm noticing these elements of rejection. I would think that my heart rate would also go up. I would think that I'd start sweating. But now I'm aware that, this is a cue that just happened. So obviously it has a trigger effect. Can we have any kind of mastery or control on our reaction?
Yes. So this is the next level, right? Like, so I think that when we talk about learning cues, step one is decoding, right? What are the 96 cues? How can I spot them, categorize them, and know what they are? The next step is encoding and internalizing. So encoding, you'll see in the book, I describe this as like a cue cycle, that it kind of creates this little cycle in our body. So after decoding, we encode. So encoding are the signals we send to others. So it's not just, I just spotted that eye roll. It's then, what do I do to keep myself calm, internalize, and counteract that eye roll to bring them back to me? So I'll give you a real example when I was selling. So I was giving a presentation and it was with a group of small executives. And this presentation mattered because it was sort of a test presentation. When you're selling, sometimes they'll like kind of have you demo your wares. So I was demoing my presentation to come in to do their big conference keynote, like their big internal corporate keynote. So I was nervous and I really wanted it to go well. And so I'm around this table and I'm pitching. And I notice the COO give me what's called a lower lid flex. That's one of the 96 cues. So the lower lid flex, you can try this with me. So just harden your lower lids as if you're trying to see better. If you harden your lower lids, right? the way that you can also try this is try to see something on the very far side of the room, like try to see a little speck on the wall. You'll narrow your eyes to try to see it. This is a universal cue. And what research has found is that when we squint our eyes, our lids are trying to block in the amount of light coming into our eyes so we can see more details. So when we're afraid, we widen our eyes to take in as much as possible. We don't need to see details, we need to see as much of the environment as possible. So we widen. In a lower lid flex, we shrink our eyes to lower light so we can see details better. And that's actually what happens. When you shrink your lids and harden your lid, you see better. You can like read farther away. So that's why when people are doing eye tests, they're like X, G, because they're trying to see details. Okay. So I noticed the hardened lower lid flex, and lower lid flex is not a bad cue. It's not a danger zone cue. I call bad cues danger zone cues. It's not a danger zone cue. It's actually a high competence cue. It signals that someone went from listening to scrutinizing, or listening to judging. And it's usually an indication that someone is unclear, trying to figure something out, is feeling skeptical. Well, as a seller, that's extremely helpful for me to know, right? So I noticed that he like hardened his lower lids, gave me a little head tilt. And so I paused and I said, this all makes sense? All good? Any questions? So instead of continuing on with my 15 slides that I had next, I took questions early. And I looked right at him when I said it. I was like, all good? Any questions? Because I knew there was some hang up that he had in his head. And he said, yeah, I'm confused about something. And I was teaching about oxytocin. So oxytocin, I talk about it in Captivate, is the chemical of connection, makes us feel the warm and fuzzies. And he said, I don't understand. How can this chemical be the warm and fuzzies? I think that my wife had oxytocin when she was in labor. And it was this aha moment. I said, you're right, sir. Oxytocin is given to women to induce labor because literally oxytocin is coursing through one's bloodstream when she gives birth. For our purposes, oxytocin is socially warm. So literally oxytocin is important from the moment of birth. It was such a great aha moment because I was able to address that concern right off the bat. We kind of laughed about it, right? Everyone was like, oh yeah, right. And then I also learned for the future for teaching that when I teach about oxytocin, I have to give a caveat. I have to say, as a seller, as a teacher, oxytocin is a very complicated chemical. It does a lot of things in our bodies. But for our purposes, that has helped me prevent future lower lid hardens because I learned how to be a better teacher. So that was a very long answer to yes. The answer is yes.